So grab your slugger, grab your chopper, and prepare to give the galaxy a good kicking. Let's talk about the strength of the greenskins in Warhammer 40K. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking Orks and what the greenest meanest faction in the game can achieve on the tabletops of the 41st millennium. In the video we're going to do a complete overview of one of the most brutal but cunning factions around. We'll talk about their place in 9th edition, some of the strongest rules from their codex and the ones that might be most commonly used in strong armies, go through each and every unit in brief and which ones I feel are strongest right now, and finish up with two very different example army lists for strong ways that you can play the faction. Plenty to talk about, so let's charge headlong straight into it. So Orks in 40k are generally a fun army to play on the tabletop, usually both with and against. What's not to like about a hyper-violent faction of fungoid death machines charging headlong towards the enemy, or trying to blast the enemy to death with unstable creations cobbled together from scraps? In-game in 9th edition, the Orks really have waxed and waned a bit, perhaps kind of middling when the edition first rolled around. Their codex did give them a massive boost, with some builds suddenly becoming insanely strong, particularly buggies and flyer spam, hoovering enemy armies off the table without much difficulty, though they were quite quickly and brutally nerfed back into line, both with points adjustments and restrictions to the number of those things that you can take. Over the past half a year or so, they kind of have dropped off quite hard in terms of power levels, one of the weaker factions in the game for a while, but I do think that the Warzone Nephilim changes have helped them out somewhat, really quite nice points cuts to certain key units and infantry across the board. Plus I really quite like the changes to their WAR ability, giving them extra strength and invulnerable saves on top of all the good stuff it did before. Currently I'd put Orks at the lower end of the mid tier, a bit more of a challenging faction to play with and win at the moment, but still above the weakest factions in the game, and they are getting some decent tournament results here and there. They're not an army without some big issues, but they've still got a decent amount of strong stuff. In terms of the army's strength, most units are fairly dangerous in melee, particularly so with the excellent Goffs clan, which gives you extra strength and exploding sixes to hit. Quite a lot of units do at least a fair amount of damage for the points, at least if you can get them where they need to be. Both WAR and Speed WAR I think are really quite strong abilities, giving them big boosts to their damage and potentially mobility or durability as well. I do like the way that both of them seem quite viable to build around, depending on whether you want a more infantry / foot slogging Ork WAR, or if you want to go heavy on their speed freaks and vehicles. In terms of their datasheets, maybe some standout units are scary flyers like the Wasbomb Blaster Jet, big hitting bosses, kill rigs, buggies, truck boys, and now with the points cuts I do feel like quite a lot of the boys variants are kind of interesting. Still though, it's really not all good news. There's still plenty of datasheets in the codex that are just underwhelming to bad no matter which way you slice them. Orks seem to have a very big cross-faction issue with morale. Even losing a couple of casualties in a squad means that you have a pretty decent chance of losing more due to low leadership all around. If you're thinking about shooting lists, then 4+ or 5+ ballistic skill is horribly vulnerable to modifiers. They hate shooting at things in dense cover or anything else that has a -1 to hit innately. Most units do have quite a high toughness, but if the enemy just hits them with volume fire, then low saves can often mean that lots of wounds sneak through. And at least compared with some of the other factions in 40k, I feel like Orks have less opportunities for really big synergies on big units. There just aren't that many support options for layered buffs or making one unit OP. They need to rely on a bit more of a multiple small unit approach. Still though, while they're not currently one of the powerhouses of 9th edition, I still think they've got plenty of strong stuff, and certain lists can compete well with the other mid-tier factions. So let's go over the Ork army bit by bit, and we'll start out with core rules that apply to big chunks of the army. First up, pretty much all Ork datasheets have Here We Go, the one that allows them to re-roll charges, and it's quite nice to have that little bit of extra reliability and saving command points on charge rolls that you just happen to whiff. Certainly not bad for any of the combat units out there, and helps outweigh some of their slightly slow movement characteristics. It is quite nice if you have any Orks arriving from reserve as well. You get almost a 50-50 chance of making it a 9-inch charge with that rule, though a chance slightly worse than the coin flip isn't exactly reliable. Orks have their own unique weapon class in Daka weapons, which sort of equates to slightly worse rapid fire weapons as a class really. You get more shots within half range, but not usually double. It was a bit painful that quite a lot of assault weapons became Daka weapons, as it means that you can't go advancing and shooting your shooter boys now. But even if their base rules as a class aren't particularly powerful, there's still plenty of efficient examples of them just for how they're pointed. Maybe some of the best are things like Warbike Daka guns, or the super shooters mounted on the Daka jets. Particularly at half range they can be spitting out a fair amount of inaccurate lead. Lots of units in the Ork Codex have the mob rule, This one is their ability to help mitigate the worst impacts of morale, though it's way worse for big units than it was in the previous book. This one means that if you're within 6 inches of another mob that isn't under half strength, you don't take the combat attrition penalty for being under half strength yourself if you happen to fail a leadership test. It means that if you can stay close to other undamaged orc units, then it means that your models will usually only run away on a 1 after you fail morale. It can certainly save an orc boy from running away from time to time, but it doesn't stop morale tests from being a painful time for orcs. The initial casualty lost is pretty annoying, plus you might still roll a whole bunch of 1s and suffer some fairly unacceptable casualties to the squad. Ramshackle is a keyword that's on quite a lot of orc vehicles. This one gives them an extra bit of durability against low strength weapons as they break off non-essential bits. Most orc vehicles get a -1 damage versus anything strength 7 or lower, and it gives them really good protection against certain armies that rely on those. Say elite melee infantry like Sanguinary Guard or Sisters Repentia won't enjoy having their damage 2 turned down to damage 1. And autocannons and things that should be excellent into orc buggies get made significantly less so by this. Kinda depends on what you're facing though. Against some armies it's great, against some armies worthless. Beast Snaggers were an introduction with the latest Orc Codex with all their fun Savage Orc kits. The ones affected get the +1 to hit against vehicles and monsters, a 6+ invul, and also access to a few stratagems such as their Beast Snagger transhuman equivalent. Quite handy buffs to have access to, though sometimes they'll matter a lot more than others. Finally, and perhaps one of the most exciting army-wide abilities, is the War and the Speed War. This one's laid out on the right here. You get the benefit depending on whether you pick a regular war boss, a beast boss, or speed boss, and it gives you a 2-turn advantage at the most critical point in the game. If you've built around a regular war boss or a beast boss, then you'll basically be incentivized to take lots of core melee units. On the first turn, it gives you advance and charge with core and characters, a really nice boost for getting them into combat, +1 strength and attacks to orc models in your army in general, so a very nice melee boost there, and a 5+ invul save for the turn. Pretty massive when a lot of orcs have a 6+ t-shirt save. And then on the turn after, you still get the strength and attacks benefit and a 6+ invul, but advance and charge goes. Really quite a nice one to trigger early there. I think that's going to be triggered turn 1 or 2 in quite a lot of games. Otherwise, if you take a speed boss like a Deathkiller Wartrike or a war boss on Warbike, that one gives you advance and shoot with assault weapons, an extra shot with Dakka weapons across the army, quite nice for warbikes and Dakka jets, and perhaps most importantly, orc vehicles and bikers get to improve the AP of their ranged attacks by 1, a massive great big boost to a ranged damage type list. Orc armies usually tend to build around one of these or the other, kind of incentivizing to go big on the speed freaks and vehicles or big on the melee units, though you can do both if you're Goffs as well, with Ghazghkull Thraka leading them with his Great War. Moving on, let's talk through some of the rule sections of the Codex. As with all 9th edition codexes, Codex Orcs has a big ton of options, so for these ones I'll just try and focus on the ones that I think are most powerful and most likely to be included in army lists. First up, they've got a fun rule section called Specialist Mobs. 1 unit per detachment can take one of these free upgrades, but they do have to swap out their clan culture for it. So say if you were playing Goffs, they wouldn't be quite as strong in melee, or might not shoot quite as well if they were bad moons. There's a fair few options, but I think that maybe these guys are some of the most interesting. Truck Boys I think are perhaps one of the most interesting power boosts. You can give these to boys, knobs, or warboss units, and it allows you to disembark after a truck moves. That means that you get the entire movement range of the truck, the extra distance that they get to disembark with, and then even after that they still get to move, potentially advance in the war, and charge after. It does mean that with this upgrade you could have a scary combat unit get halfway across the board in a single turn and start kicking the enemy's teeth in. I think a unit of boys in a truck with this upgrade is rarely going to be a particularly bad idea in most armies, and you could certainly apply it to the knobs as well, who can add a lot of melee threat into one concentrated space. Otherwise, perhaps some of the other strong ones are Horrible Gits for Gretchen. This one gives a Gretchen squad obsec, which makes them quite nice for holding down home field objectives and things, but you do need to keep your other units away as it would give them -1 to hit. And I think that Boom Boys is pretty interesting for tank busters or death copters. They basically make the rockets an extra AP -1 better. Say if you were playing a melee clan and you wanted some tank busters, this could be quite an easy upgrade, as the melee upgrades don't really matter too much for the tank busters themselves. AP -1 rockets could be quite interesting for death copters in speed mob as well. Another fun section are the custom jobs. These are the ones that give you some points upgrades to make orc vehicles a bit faster, more dangerous or more durable, and I think a fair few of them are at least usable, though strength wise I'm not sure they're massively undercosted or anything. Even for the good ones I think you more or less get the utility that you pay for. Squig hide tires is 15 points and it gives you +1 move or +2 inches if you're advancing. That one's quite nice on kill rigs, which can advance and charge in war because they're characters. An extra couple of inches threat range could actually key them up for something like a first turn charge, which is pretty terrifying. Fortress on Wheels is quite a popular upgrade for battle wagons. That's +20 points for a 5+ invul. Now battle wagons with death rollers are kind of good. It's quite an interesting upgrade for that. And it could give you just a little bit more insurance for truck boys not having their truck shot out from underneath them. I think Zap Crumpers is actually kind of interesting on a big burner boy mob, particularly now they went down in points. It is 2 points a model, which is a bit on the pricey side, but it means that their melee attacks deal mortal wounds as well. In the war, that could make them quite an interesting ranged and melee threat as well. Shocker Hull is one that I've seen used occasionally, 15 points for dealing D3 mortal wounds to enemies that attack them on a 4+. Probably best on something big and tough if you're using it, like a battle wagon or a kill rig. And Nitro Squigs I think is kind of interesting for the Rocket Truck Squig buggers, +1 to win with their Squig launchers, though I think that its utility has dropped a fair bit with the nerf to the barrage weapons. I don't really quite think that any of them are mandatory, but could be kind of interesting depending on what you're trying to do with the unit. Orky Psychic next, and for me I think that the Weird Boys far outweigh the utility of the Were Boys. The standard Orc discipline is a fair bit better than the Beast Head one. Da Jump is really quite nice to deliver units whether they're shooting or combat orientated. Even if the charge is kind of risky, it could still be a really big power move to have a chance of assaulting something that you really shouldn't be able to halfway across the board, and can be quite nice for getting lines of sight on things or jumping onto objectives. Warpath is a nice generic melee boost to a unit, +1 attack per model is really good. And if you're trying to build around a super fighty orc war boss, then Fists of Gork is great. +2 attacks and +2 strength mean that a fighty war boss gets even more so. Really nice in combination with relics and warlord traits like brutal but cunning. Generally, I'm not quite as sold as the Were Boys for the Beasthead discipline. I just don't think that they add that much value. But the Beasthead discipline is still kind of relevant, as you'll see it on kill rigs and things. Frazzle I think is particularly good for that one, as the kill rigs have an enormous profile, so that could hit quite a lot of units if you're positioned well. Moving on to character upgrades, and I think one of the best ones for war bosses is Brutal but Cunning, a kind of ridiculously strong damage output one, where you get an extra attack for every single attack that doesn't make it through to inflict damage on your foe. Depending on the target, that could nearly double the damage output that you might be getting on them. Pretty great on an already fighty war boss, who's likely going to be packing some sort of combat relic as well. Another great one is Arda's Nails, a -1 to wounds debuff that's good on anything that's big and tough, perhaps a mega armoured war boss or a beast boss on a Squigosaur. There's some really nice durability relics that can combine with as well to make some boss that's super tanky. If you're running speed freaks, then that junk boss one I think is kinda good. A 4+ invul save is quite nice on a Death Killer Wartrike. I think that the Speed King Warlord trait from Speed Mob, if you're running them, is quite fun. Reroll ones to wound on your nearby Speed Freak units is quite a nice force multiplier. For Orky relics, I do feel that pretty much the entire section of Orc relics is at least somewhat usable, kind of a novelty in 40k. Usually you get some ones that are good and some ones that are just plain outclassed. Da Killer Claw is a really nice easy one to upgrade a war boss with, a damage 3 AP -4 power claw with no -1 to hit. Simple, uncomplicated, and should help you deal with some Terminators maybe. Edwopper's Kill Chopper's another nice one, a damage 2 AP -3 big chopper with some mortal wounds, and it's quite nice on knobs with Smasher Squigs. The Dead Shiny Shooter I think is maybe a slightly underrated choice. On a big mech hitting on 4s it actually gives you a pretty decent amount of damage output, and interestingly enough I think far outshoots the Shock Attack Gun, despite that one looking far more impressive. Finally, there's 3 awesome durability upgrades, the Beast Hide Mantle for a 5+ Feel No Pain and extra attacks, the Super Cyborg Body, and the Crushing Armor for better mega armor with a +1 to saves, plus some mortal wound impacts. Depending on the model that you're using, I think you could make a case for any of these, and they combine really nicely with Arda's Nails. I'd say perhaps maybe the most underwhelming relic of the lot is the Scorched Git Bones, but even that one you can make a case for on a kill rig. Stratagems in Codex Orcs I think got toned down really quite a lot since the last Codex. There were loads of great ones that you could use on big units of boys now, and a lot of these have just been taken down. Just a few that are a bit more generally applicable is a 1 to 2 CP one for extra 3-inch pile-in and consolidation. Situational, but if it makes the difference between tagging an enemy shooting unit, that's going to be quite well worth the investment. I think Ramming Speed is a really nice one for vehicles. A 3d6-inch charge makes your charge range threat far higher, and it's quite nice for things like Deathcopters coming in from Deep Strike. Makes your charge very likely in combination with Here We Go, plus you get some mortal wounds. Cloud of Smoke is quite a nice one if you are running multiple units of Speed Freaks. It gives them a -1 to hit near one big unit, and seeing as these Speed Freak units can be quite big and sizable, you could apply that to most of your army. And I do quite like the Transhuman Physiology type one for Beast Snaggers as well. A little on the pricey side, but if you're going to have a squad just absolutely blown to bits and this could save them, then so much the better. Finally, before we get into the Orky clans, we've got the secondaries, and with the new Warzone Nephilim updates, I do feel that all of them are usable, but some of them you have to build towards, or it might depend on your opponent's list. Not a bad spot for faction secondaries maybe. Green Tide is definitely one that you need to build around a bit. It's only going to work for Orky armies that are slightly on the hoardy side, but it's very hard to counter if you do so. You need 10 plus Ork models in each table quarter, and not within 6 inches of another. But that is pretty achievable as it happens at the end of your turn, and it's pretty hard to counter for the opponent. Get the Good Bits is a nice one to do middle board actions for 3 victory points or 5 victory points. If you can have some Gretchen beavering away at that over the course of the game, then that could rack up the points quite quickly. The Biggest and the Best can be an interesting one for a fighty Orc war boss. It could be a bit all or nothing if they do get killed kind of early, but you can rack up 2 victory points a turn just for sitting on midfield objectives, and they can get even more if they manage to damage units or kill characters. Finally, Stomp 'em Good I think is maybe a little bit more unreliable. You need to kill more enemy units in melee than they kill of yours. Some armies might have very little melee, so doing the more than might not be hard, but I think you're typically going to be quite unlikely to kill a unit in melee on the first turn of the game unless they advance towards you, and you always could have a turn where you just don't manage to kill anything and you pass up the 3 victory points. Not unusable, but I think that you're quite unlikely to max this one. Still though, I think that the secondaries are quite well balanced. I think perhaps Green Tide might be the most powerful if you build towards it, particularly with the various mobs of boys that mainly went down in points a bit. Next up, let's talk about the Orc clans, and I think most of them do have some genuinely interesting stuff to attract you to play them, and I thought it was worth talking about the Speed Mob Army of Renown on this list as well, seeing as that basically replaces your clan culture, even though you can double up with some other clan options. I'd say at the moment, particularly with the changes to War, that Goffs are probably the strongest all-round right now. Having an all-round buff to melee damage isn't bad on a fairly combat-heavy faction. They get exploding 6s to hit in combat, and +1 strength on the charge, really quite nice when you can combine that with the War abilities. You could have things like standard Beast Snagger boys hitting at strength 7 with basic choppers. On a lot of units that's going to equate to something like a 40% increase in damage or more. It kind of depends on whether or not the strength bracket makes a difference or not. Besides that, they also have a stratagem to amp up their melee even further, and they have access to Ghazghkull Thracker, who is a pretty big meaty melee threat in the middle of a list, hands out some buffs, and also allows you both wars at once. It does seem that the majority of competitive Orc lists do seem to be building around Goffs at the moment, but I think that you can actually make some pretty solid arguments for using at least the majority of the other clans depending on the list. Evil Sons get +1 inch move or 2 inch if you're speed freaks, have a fun drive-by Daka stratagem for move shoot move with some buggies or something, and Resmecha's Redder Paint is a really quite nice war boss upgrade, making an enemy unit fight last. Their Warlord trait isn't bad either, getting advance and charge on a unit. Pretty much every bit of their faction benefits seem quite usable. Blood Axes got massively expanded with a Warzone supplement. They've got some fallback shenanigans and stealthier 18 inch range, and I think the main thing to draw you to them is their flexibility more than anything else. They've got a couple of nice Warlord traits for generating more command points, a redeployment option, and then plenty of interesting stratagems for helping out things like commandos or storm boys. I do think that that surprise stratagem is really quite good. For the lucky blue gits of the Death Skulls, they've got rather a strong faction trait. Their infantry get Obsec, they get a single reroll per attack, and they have a 5+ save against mortal wounds, not too bad with how many tend to go around in 9th edition. Their Wrecker's stratagem can be pretty handy against big vehicles as well. Quite a nice thing to have if you're fighting knights or something. The Speed Mob Army of Renown, as I mentioned, isn't really a clan, as you do get this plus being a clan, but it does replace the clan culture, meaning that you're mainly getting the clan benefits from warlord traits or stratagems or things. Speed Mob does heavily restrict what you can take. You can't take anything that isn't a speed freak or plane, but for those penalties you get Obsec Bikers, units that can advance and shoot round the board so go well fast, +1 attack on the charge which is handy on everything, and also an across the board invul and a better one if you advance. On top of that, you've got the Speed King trait for some rerolls, crashing through for some mortal wound impacts, fall back and shoot as a stratagem which is quite nice on big buggy units that you don't really want locked up, and some fairly godly and threatening death copters that can jump onto the board, blow some stuff up, potentially even charge something, and then disappear into the sun. Quite fun that it's a very different way to build orcs, though it certainly does have its disadvantages, Generally you'd want to build around an outrider detachment, the CP perhaps being a bit painful to give up when you're in Nephilim. Finally, for what I'd consider the mid-tier armies are freebooters, maybe another interesting way to run a mainly vehicle shooty list. Their main benefit is to give them +1 to hit on shooting units after you've killed something. Hitting on 4s will usually give you a 50% shooting buff for most Ork firepower, so if you plan to run Ork gun lists, then this is probably the strongest trait unless you're playing for speed freaks. They've got some fun Auspex shenanigans as well, but mainly their big benefits is just shooting things really hard. Finally, perhaps on the slightly weaker side, I think are the Bad Moons and the Snake Bites. Bad Moon's shooting buff is just really quite underwhelming compared with freebooters, I'm afraid. It's not that they're unusable, and they're quite good if you're spamming loads of dagger weapons, but it just doesn't seem to be one of the optimal ways to play Orks at the moment. Perhaps if the freebooters trait didn't exist, then it'd be a bit more tempting. Otherwise, I think Snake Bites are just a little bit underwhelming. Their clan trace is just one of the most limited of the whole lot. It only applies to a few solid squig units, and their toughness boost only really helps against strength 6 or 7 weapons due to most Orks being toughness 5. They're not unusable, but I feel that they were a lot more tempting when you could take them as an allied detachment to another clan and just use them to focus on the good units like, say, their Squighog boys. Overall, my summary will be that Goffs are currently the biggest and the best, though most of the other clans do remain interesting and usable. Moving on, let's talk orky units, and we'll start out with the squads, the infantry, cavalry and bikes. I think this section in general just got a fair bit more interesting with some nice points cuts to boys, grots, and most of the other variant boy type units. Most of those had just been a bit overshadowed since the codex came out. First up, we've got boys and beast snagger boys, 8 and 10 points respectively, both fairly decent at melee versus light infantry. I'd usually run them in squads of 10, and I think they're quite a tempting unit to plonk in battle wagons or kill rigs to actually make sure they get a good charge with a good number before they just get all shot up. Truck boys I think are particularly threatening, and on the beast snagger boys side, the +1 strength and invul is nice. I think that both boys and beast snagger boys are fairly well balanced right now. Otherwise, we've got Gretchen, recently dropped to 40 points, so they've become very cheap troops fillers, nice for plonking on home field objectives or maybe doing things like actions. Don't really expect them to do any significant damage to anything, but as a speed bump, screening units, or just slot filler, then plenty of lists can find a use for them. In the elite section, burner boys are 10 points. They've got pretty okay shooting with a flamer attack and a nice AP2 melee stratagem. Again, a fairly reasonable choice to put in things like battle wagons, but I do feel that they're a little bit limited in mainly being effective against infantry and not much else. At least the flamers can stack a whole bunch of saves though. Commandos, I think, are a very tempting unit to take right now. 11 points for some nice screening. Put them in cover in the midfield and they can have a 3+ save against ranged attacks with their special rules, and also get a nice +1 to wound when they're near cover as well, giving them quite a meaty damage output. Still though, at just 55 points for a unit that can sit in the midfield, screen out the enemies, and still be at least somewhat dangerous to light infantry, I think they're a good deal. A couple of units is pretty handy for helping win the mission as a whole. Mega Knobs are maybe the go-to Ork Elite infantry, pretty tough, okay melee, though I still don't think that they're massively outstanding for the points. Plenty of lists do seem to make use of them, either on foot or coming out of battle wagons and things, and they do have a fairly nice +1 damage stratagem against certain targets. The standard knobs I'd maybe consider just a touch on the underwhelming side compared with boys. I don't think that they're quite as efficient from the raw numbers, and even less so seeing as boys went down. If you did want to make a unit work, then I'd seriously consider fielding them as truck boys, as it does let you put quite a lot of hurt and at least some relative toughness into the truck, and then zoom them away to deliver them quite reliably. Finally, in the elites we have tank busters. Okay damage output against vehicles, though not really so much against other things. Their heavy weapons are just a little bit on the painful side, I must admit. Hitting on 6s when you're moving just isn't great. They are also pretty fragile for the points cost as well, so pretty much need a transport or something like a teleporting boss bunker perhaps. Generally okay damage output in ideal circumstances, but not the easiest to use. In the fast attack section we've got Squighog boys, a fairly good all-rounder unit, and I think one of the better melee units in the faction perhaps. Good speed at 10 inches, pretty decent melee on the charge with those stickers, good defense with 3 wounds and toughness 6 at 25 points, though I must admit morale is a really bad issue for them. Only being leadership 6 is really painful when you might be losing more of these expensive models if you take a casualty or two. Still though, lots of lists seem to be running multiple squads of these, a good combination of fairly tough, fairly dangerous and fairly fast. Storm boys are faster and a bit more flexible, having the fly keyword, pretty useful for objectives and actions, particularly as they can deep strike. They're very nice in War as well, when their advance gives them an automatic 6 inches at the expense of taking some casualties. It's very nice to be getting the charge with Orks rather than the other way round. Warbikes I think are okay anti-infantry units, quite tough and decent volume shooting, particularly in Speed War with extra shots and extra AP on those Dagger guns. A few big units can produce an awful lot of lead, and they're particularly nice in freebooters as well, where they can potentially hit on 4s. Finally, for fast attack, we have Deathcopters. These helicopter bikes are technically vehicles, so maybe belong on the next slide really, but they do function as a squad really. They're quite a nice mixed threat unit in the Speed War, with better AP rockets, and swooping down from nowhere for a ramshackle charge on an isolated unit. If they can make use of both their rockets and their melee, then they're quite good value, though they are fairly easy to kill for the points if they ever get exposed. Finally, for squads in the heavy support, we have the Flash Gits. I'd say they're one of the more underwhelming units in the Orks Codex right now. Their shooting isn't terrible, though it's a bit mediocre, and being heavy is very unhelpful for getting big penalties to your hit roll. Looters I'd also put in a fairly similar barrel. They did drop in points down to 14 points, and that isn't generally too bad for autocannon armed units, but strength 7, AP -1 and damage 2 just isn't a great place in 40k right now. There's loads of things with -1 damage, lots of things with armor of contempt that ignore the AP -1, and it just means that there's a fair few matchups that they're just not going to be all that worth it. Out of these units, maybe the ones that I most expect for the Orks to field in competitive lists will be the 3 variants of troops, certainly commandos and perhaps some mega knobs from the elites, and squighog boys and maybe some deathcopters from the fast attack. I think that most of the rest still remain just about usable, but maybe a bit more niche or in smaller numbers. Moving on, let's talk about ramshackle cobbled together creations of the mechs and the various flavours of Ork vehicles. We've already touched on the standard truck, which is cheap and effective with some ramshackle wounds. Probably not the best bet for loading up loads of squads into. I think honestly for more general purpose transportation you get better value out of battle wagons, but because of this truck boys specialist mob you can have an enormous slingshot to throw some boys into combat, and from there it can be cheap expendable chaff jumping on objectives or tying up enemy units. In the fast attack slot, besides the Deathcopters which we mentioned already, we've got the 5 flavours of Ork buggies, all of which I'd still say are pretty much usable. Maybe my favourite out of the lot of them might be the Megatrack Scrapjets at the moment. A solid amount of rocket fire, good movement, and some really quite great melee with that nose drill. I think that you get some very solid return on investment there. Otherwise, the squig buggies were a bit of a staple, but the barrage nerf really hurt them quite a bit. -1 to hit really is exactly what they don't want. The custom booster blaster I think is quite nice, particularly with the flamers at close range. Those things are cheap and can stack a surprising amount of wounds if the enemy gets close. The Boomdacker Snaz wagon I still don't think is terrible, but I do find the shooting just a touch more underwhelming. Probably my least favourite out of the buggies, but not by that much. And finally, the Shock Jump Dragster does have a fair amount of anti-tank firepower, maybe not quite as much as the Scrapjets, but it does also have the fun option to teleport in a pinch if you desperately need a unit somewhere else on the board, maybe a bit more relevant in the speed mob where they can advance and shoot. Otherwise, there's a ton of Ork vehicles in the heavy support. Battle wagons are pretty awesome right now, seeing as they went down in points so much. They're 105 points base, which is really quite tough for a transport with ramshackle and as many wounds as it has, and I think I'd usually want to upgrade to a death roller for an extra 15 points, as it actually turns it from a transport into a fairly credible melee threat as well, and can quite happily run over some medium infantry. Quite nice for carting about the Ork boys that are a bit more expensive. Perhaps things like burner boys, tank busters or looters can happily find a place here. Kill rigs were initially increased in points, but then went back down to what they were before, and they remain a very strong all-round threat. They've got melee, they've got shooting, they've got decent psychic, they've got a transport capacity for now cheaper beast snagger boys, and they're fairly quick and at least reasonably tough to boot. Quite popular in competitive lists, and can be interesting with those squig hide tyres and advancing and charging in turn 1 of the war. The hunter rig I don't think is quite as interesting. Giving up that whir tower for the points cost I don't think is quite worth it. I don't think that the extra transport capacity quite makes it work. Otherwise, I must admit I've got a soft spot for mech guns in the heavy support. Very cheap and pretty effective firepower. For the points cost converting into anti-tank damage they're pretty nice, and they're really quite tough as well. Their utility is just a bit limited by their morale and squad size though. If you take more than one, then there's every chance that the second one's just going to run away as soon as the first one dies, so perhaps best off fielding just in squads of 1 if you do have the heavy support slots available. Custom mega cannons are still the way to go in my opinion. Finally, for the heavy support, we've got the Orky Walkers. Death Dreads and Killer Cans are both just a little bit underwhelming in my opinion, though perhaps not unusably so. For the Death Dreads, I'd go for full melee with a bunch of arms or custom Mega Blasters, but I do feel that they're a bit borderline worth it. It's perhaps similar for the killer cans, at least you get a fair amount of ramshackle wounds on the table with them. Maybe a bit more of a mixed role unit with a bit of melee and a bit of slightly more accurate ranged fire, but nothing outstanding. Flyers wise, the Jet and the Wasbomb Blaster Jet, I think both are excellent shooting platforms, far better than the bombers in my opinion currently, and really quite nice in things like freebooters and speed war, jumping to the other side of the table and can do enough damage in a single round of shooting to make the entire investment worth it. More people seem to prefer the high investment, high reward Wasbomb with its massive D3 plus 3 damage shooting attacks, though I feel like the Jet is still very good for the points cost for the sheer amount of bullets that you can make it fly the enemy's way. Ideally get it hitting on 4s with freebooters and you're good to go. The Lords of War I don't think are very well balanced. We've got the Stomper Gorkanaut and Morkanaut, all of which I think are just a bit underwhelming for their points cost and don't really hold up to the sheer amount of anti-tank that 9th edition can throw at them. More fun and fluffy choices for more casual games at the moment, I'm afraid. Finally, for the fortifications, they still have issues with 9th edition terrain deployment. I think the Big Head Boss Bunker is far better than the Mech Workshop, which really isn't worth the cost. The Boss Bunker does have that crazy combo that you can do with the Teleporter stratagem, allowing it to deep strike into battle. Load it up with a bunch of tank busters, and they'll all be able to fire their rockets out at their chosen target and not take the penalty for moving. A bit of a fun meme strategy. Could be kind of devastating on the right target though, and at least after that the tank busters are protected. Out of the Ork vehicles, I think that quite a lot of them are usable, though perhaps it depends a bit on whether you're playing a bit more of a speed mob type list or a regular WoW with support. If you're going for a bit more of a melee-centric Ork army, then I think things like the Battle Wagon and Kill Rig are excellent transports, maybe a truck to zoom some boys towards the enemy, and perhaps fill out a little bit of the backfield with some cheap and effective mech guns for a little bit of anti-tank. If you're going more speed mob type things, then I think most of the fast attack buggies are really quite viable, and add in a couple of Jets or Wasbomb Blaster Jets for some extra scary ranged punch that can move super quick. Finally, for the orky units, we get to the war bosses and mechs, the leader characters of the army. Starting out, I actually feel that maybe one of the single most valuable choices out of the support pieces is actually the Weird Boy. Only 70 points for a couple of casts when you have some orcs around him, and then you get access to things like Dad Jump and Warpath for extra attacks. Really not bad for that cost, and he can always smite if he needs more damage. I don't really rate the Weird Boy though, he'd be better on a kill rig than on foot. Then we've got the war bosses and the beast bosses with a fair few different variant datasheets and a few special characters to boot. They kind of are a choice that's going to depend on army construction for which one of these you want, whether or not you're playing a war or a speed war, but I think just for raw value in terms of their fighting, they do have access to some really quite nice combos. You could have a foot war boss with the Killer Claw and Brutal Butt Cunning for something that can just punch hilariously above its weight. Maybe a beast boss on a Squigosaur with the Art of Snails and the 5+ Feel No Pain to make a ridiculously tanky boss, or maybe take that mega armoured war boss with the Crushing Armour. There's also the option of Mozrog's Scragbat if you're playing Snakebites. If you're taking a speed mob on the other hand, then the choices are a Deathkiller Wartrike or a war boss on bike. The Deathkiller Wartrike I don't think is anything super outstanding, but still not exactly a bad datasheet, and more one that I think people take just out of necessity than because it's amazing. Not bad to run around with that speed mob trait though, for reroll ones to wounds. The Warboss on Warbike I think is quite nice as a bit more of a punchy melee threat that you can upgrade with some of the other more generic relics. Could be tailored into a bit more of a dangerous melee threat perhaps. Currently, for more neglected HQs, people just aren't seeming to be as keen on Big Mechs or the Painboy variants. I think the Big Mechs did decline in value a little bit with the custom force field, seeing as the WAR now gives you 2 turns worth of invuls. So having one of these along to protect your creations maybe isn't quite as interesting. I guess theoretically you could get yourself 2 turns worth of 5+ invul if you blow up this force field with their stratagem turn 1, though as it goes that is quite an expensive option. Otherwise they can fix some vehicles. The Teleport Mega Blaster one and the Shiny Shooter combo can actually be surprisingly shooty and far outshoots the slightly underwhelming Shock Attack gun now. And you do have the option of a mini mech in the Elite's Choice slot, a very cheap and expendable character who can still pile a few wounds on vehicles if needed. For the Pain Boys, we've got the Pain Boss in the HQ choice and the regular one and the Mad Dog in the Elites. Again, similar to the big mechs, I'd say they're just not super outstanding right now. A 6+ Feel No Pain really does feel like you're paying a big premium for it, and I think they'd be a lot better if really big 30-man squads of boys were worth it, but most people have generally decided that they're not due to morale. Not awful, but people seem to prefer other characters at the moment. Out of the HQ section, we have the Knob on the Smasher Squig. He seems to be strong enough for people to sometimes want to run multiple of them. They've got the fun ability where the Smasher Squig does a bunch of mortal wounds when they charge in, Then the knob can follow up with a bunch of big chopper attacks. You can also take the Edwhopper's Kill Chopper as well for some extra damage output. Runt herds, including Zogrod Wartsnagger, just don't seem to do enough for the points. People don't generally want to take Mass Gretchen in any way, and they're best off just being kept cheap and effective without bothering to give them support. And finally, to round up, we've got a bunch of special characters. Ghazghkull, Thracker and Makari are big, tough and interesting. They buff nearby Goffs, and Ghazghkull can't take more than 4 wounds in a phase, meaning that a lot of lists are going to struggle to put him down with shooting, and is almost guaranteed to have some effect in combat. He also gets you that Great War ability, allowing you to build a bit more of a flexible Goth list, though admittedly he is fairly expensive at a big 300 points. Otherwise, for faction-specific bosses, we've got Boss Snickrot, who I think is just generally all-round strong for a Blood Axe force, very tempting to include if you're using a Blood Axe list. Captain Badrug, I'd say, is pretty much the opposite, not really worth including, aside from fluff and theme reasons. And Boss Zagstrug I think is fairly interesting for the Goths, really quite fast moving with some meaty damage to melee attacks, quite good for nipping around and beating up medium infantry. Overall, for maximal value out of these HQs, I feel like maybe the single best values that you can get out of these are something like a Weird Boy, plus maybe a stacked War Boss or Squigosaur Boss, and otherwise both the speed bosses are fine for leading a speed war. The knob on the Smasher Squig is decent damage output, and Ghazghkull and Snickrot are maybe some of my favourite out of the special characters. Finally, to round up, I thought we'd go over a couple of example army lists, and first up we have Ghazghkull leading a horde of mechanised Goths. This list was run by Thomas Eddy, who used it to take second at an event called High Noon Showdown. A really solid performance, and I think that the list shows a whole load of good things about a more war-focused orc list rather than a speed war. The list is made up of 2 patrol detachments and a Supreme Command detachment, though as best I can tell you're not gaining a massive amount from being in 2 patrols. Ghazghkull goes in his own Supreme Command, Makari is slotless with Ghazghkull, and unless I'm missing something, I think that the only thing that wouldn't have fit into a standard battalion detachment would be a unit of Storm Boys, so I guess it looks like you're paying 2 command points to include those, though I guess they are pretty helpful action units. I guess if you wanted to save 2 CP, you could maybe sub the Storm Boys out for something else. In any case, that aside, it's a Goths list, so the army will be getting extra attacks on 6s and an extra strength on the charge, never mind all the buffs that the War gives you. Having Ghazghkull as the Warlord is a really nice buff to nearby units. It's going to be a massive pain to deal with, as he can't just shoot him to death in any one turn, and he allows the Great War, so when he calls that, he'll be amping up both the melee units and also the vehicles. Not bad for a mechanised list. Makari is only 50 points, and is surprisingly hard to shift with a 2+ Invul save due to his luck, plus he gives you basically a Pain Boy type aura, a 6+ Feel No Pain. A good extra layer of survivability alongside Ghazghkull there. There's then a very tough beast boss on a Squigosaur. This one takes that Arda's Nails for -1 damage, and the Beast Hide Mantle for the 5+ Feel No Pain and extra attack. Ridiculously hard to kill for the cost, and still has a whole ton of damage between its regular chopper attacks and the Squigosaur's jaws. There's then a Weird Boy with Warpath and a Jump. That could be used to make one of the combat units more dangerous, and then throw it across the board to hopefully get a charge in combat, or potentially just use it to get some mobility and get more units in the right place for objectives and things. Finally, there's a mini mech with a custom Mega Slugger. 25 points for a little character that can repair a wound or so on kill rigs as they go along, and is another annoying little thing that you can put on objectives or hiding out of sight. Then, after the characters, most of the rest of the list is looking kind of symmetrical. 3 big transports full of dangerous threats, 3 units of Squighog Boys, and 3 units of small specialist boys for utility. First up, to fill out those troop sections and give some obsec, there's 3 units of Beast Snagger Boys. In Goths they really are particularly dangerous, strength 7 in the War, exploding 6s to hit, never mind any of the other buffs that they can get from war bosses being nearby, plus being obsec boys to boot. It looks like the plan will be for them to ride in the 3 different transports, 2 kill rigs and a battle wagon. Really quite a nice combination threat with those, as the transports themselves are pretty dangerous as well, never mind that they've always got the possibility to disgorge a whole bunch of fighty boys to clear out some chaff infantry and take the objectives with obsec. One of the kill rigs takes Frazzle for the mortal wounds and Squiggly Curse. That one's going to be fairly powerful with the mortal wound output. It also has the Squig Hide Tires for an extra couple of inches movement in the War. It adds up to a pretty enormous threat range overall, and then you get extra mortal wounds and some fairly scary melee when it gets in. The next kill rig takes Roar of Morg and Spirit of Gork. Maybe not quite as strong psychic powers, but still pretty useful in a kill rig that can get into the midst of the enemy. Spirit of Gork could be quite nice in combination with any one of those Squighog units. Finally, there's a standard battle wagon with a Death Roller and Fortress on wheels so it's going to be a fairly decent threat in combat and also have a 5+ invul save, a nice cheap and effective transport for the cost. Then to round the list out, there's 2 units of commandos, good units for being really tough in cover and starting on midfield objectives to get those points in early. Maybe could do things like good bits actions if they decided to go for that one. And there's also a unit of 6 storm boys as well, also will be extra good for that kind of thing, bullying enemy light infantry, and maybe jumping about doing actions and getting to objectives. And lastly, of course, before I forget, there's also 3 big units of Squighog boys as well, again super brutal in a Goffs War, getting all the way up to strength 8, massive melee threats, and they can even throw out some mortal wounds as well with bomb squigs, even if they might be a little bit vulnerable to morale. Still though, at 125 points, they add a whole lot of toughness and melee threats for what they cost. Overall, a pretty fun looking orc transport list, 3 big hitters filled with boys, 2 very scary characters following up behind, some punchy units of Squighog might, and some utility units for objectives. Looks like a fun and effective orc melee list to me. Otherwise though, here's an example of an Evil Sunz speed mob list, and to show that orcs can still be fairly effective even if they're built really quite differently. This one was a list that seems to have been run by a Kevin Leonard, who used it to take 3rd at Coast Wargaming and Warp Charge Gaming GT. Kind of goes to show that while most people are running Goff orc lists, the Speed War can still have its day if the stars align. Kevin's list is a single Outrider detachment, has used the Speed Mob Army of Renown, so basically only Speed Freaks, Planes, and Speed Bosses, and technically the Army of Renown is from the Evil Sunz, even though they give up the clan traits, they do still have some interesting options like that Drive-By Daka. The list is led by Deathkiller Wartrike, a nice lurking melee threat with the Speed King trait. That gives you reroll 1s to wound with any of your nearby freaks. If they're positioned fairly centrally, then they might be able to affect something like 12 buggies, depending on exactly how they're all set up. For the gun buggies, there's 12 units total, 3 Boomdaka Snaz wagons with the damage to strength 7, 3 Megatrack scrapjets for all the rockets, 3 Rocket Rock Squig buggies for the ignores line of sight, 3 Shock Drum dragsters for the anti-tank and potential teleporting, and they should be a fair bit tougher than normal with the speed mob invul saves, plus that stratagem that can give them a -1 to hit. It looks like on the starting command points you would have enough CP to make that happen. They'll all have loads of mobility as well, advancing around and firing at full effect. Then there's a small unit of 3 Warbikers, which will be OBSEC in this detachment, quite nice expendable units for zooming out to far-flung objectives I guess. A unit of 5 Deathcopters, which could be Deep Strike reserved, and then charge in with Ramshackle, or potentially disappear with that Into the Sun stratagem. They take the Boom Boys Specialist mob upgrade, so that's better AP on their rockets, and one of them has a big bomb and custom Mega Blaster. Finally, there's 2 very scary Wasbomb Blaster Jets, both of them take 2 Teleport Blasters, the Force Field and the Super Shooter. Horrendously scary planes that if they roll well could blast some heavy hitters right off the table, though they are going to be some fairly big losses of points if they do go down. Overall, fast, hard hitting, and we'll get a lot of benefit out of the Speed War with all the extra AP. Good to see that Mad Max style orcs can still be pretty effective with a good list and a good general. So I think that just about brings us to the end of our look at orcs in 40k 9th edition. Hopefully that's given orky generals just a little bit of inspiration as to how best to chop up the enemy in Nephilim. As always, let me know what you think down in the comments below. Feel free to add any other tips or suggestions from seasoned orc players. Any tips or corrections are greatly appreciated. If you've enjoyed the video, feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics. I'll certainly keep the regular 40k Tactics videos coming, and I'm sure we'll have plenty more for the orcs in the future. Finally, if you have been enjoying the videos on the channel, I would just like to quickly mention the Auspex Tactics Patreon page, which is how I can afford to make quite so many big videos like this quite so regularly. Big faction overviews like this do take an awful lot of time to make, so if you are enjoying regularly, any support is enormously appreciated. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things come next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.